Sir, hello, you live here?
Yes, I live here.
Okay, can I see some ID, please? ID confirmed, standing by.
At approximately 7:18 p.m. on a weekday evening in the West Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts, a 911 call was placed reporting a suspicious man attempting to access a residential property on Hawthorne Street. The caller stated that the individual was seen entering the front yard, using a key at the door, and moving items from a vehicle into the home. The caller described the man as black and claimed he did not appear to belong at the address. Boston police units were dispatched within minutes. Body-worn camera footage later confirmed that officers arrived to find the man standing on the front steps of the property, holding a set of keys and identification. He identified himself by name and provided proof of residency. What responding officers did not initially acknowledge on camera was that the homeowner was not only the lawful occupant of the residence, but also the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the city. The responding officers continued questioning. The caller remained inside a nearby property, observing through a window. Dispatch logs recorded the language used to justify the stop. Supervisors were notified. Within hours, internal communications began circulating inside Boston Police Department leadership. The incident did not end on Hawthorne Street. It triggered administrative reviews, media inquiries, and policy discussions concerning bias-based 911 calls and discretionary enforcement authority. Public records requests later revealed inconsistencies between the original dispatch narrative and internal assessments. What began as a routine call for service became a case study in institutional response, authority recognition, and the mechanics of racially coded suspicion within municipal policing. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. I was told this channel wouldn't reach 1,000 subscribers, but stories like this deserve to be heard. Your support helps bring these cases to light and proves that these stories matter. At approximately 7:18 p.m., a patrol unit from the Boston Police Department was dispatched to 14 Hawthorne Street in West Roxbury following a 911 call reporting a suspicious person. The caller stated that a black male was attempting to enter a residence and moving items from a vehicle into the property. The dispatcher relayed that the caller believed the individual did not look like a resident. No break-in had been confirmed. No property damage was reported. The call was categorized as suspicious activity. When officers arrived, body-worn camera footage captured a man standing at the front door holding a set of keys. A vehicle was parked in the driveway with boxes visible in the rear seat. The officer approached and stated, "Sir, we received a report that you don't belong at this residence." The man responded, "This is my property." The officer then asked for identification to verify residency. The camera angle showed keys in the man's hand as he reached for his wallet. The officers had not yet run a property database check before initiating questioning. They relied on the dispatch framing of the call, which emphasized uncertainty about the man's legitimacy at the address. The interaction proceeded as a field investigation rather than a routine verification through records. Within minutes, the man produced identification confirming his name and position. He was a police commissioner of the Boston Police Department and the lawful owner of the residence. The central incident began with a neighbor observing a black man entering a home and contacting emergency services to report suspicion. The caller did not identify herself publicly at the time and stated she believed the individual did not appear to belong at the address. There were no prior burglary reports tied to the property. The officers treated the situation according to suspicious person protocol, initiating questioning and requesting proof of residency. The significance of the case extends beyond the individuals involved. The incident demonstrates how racial descriptors in emergency calls can influence dispatch categorization and officer approach. The language used by the caller was relayed without additional verification, framing the event as potentially criminal. Officers responded under that framing. The event raises questions about how discretion is exercised when verifying property ownership and whether database confirmation should precede in-person confrontation when no crime has been reported. The case also tests institutional consistency. When the subject of the call was identified as the department's highest-ranking official, the nature of the incident shifted from routine service call to internal risk matter. Supervisors were notified shortly after the identification was confirmed. According to internal communications later reviewed, The recognition of the homeowner's identity prompted immediate command-level awareness. The core conflict in this case centers on authority versus citizen, but in a reverse configuration. At the time of contact, the responding officers exercise authority over a private citizen based on a caller's suspicion. Once identification was presented, it became clear that the individual being questioned held supervisory authority over the department itself. The dynamic changed, not because of new evidence of criminal activity, but because of status recognition. Another layer of conflict concerns perceived ownership versus documented ownership. The caller's perception that the man did not belong at the address triggered emergency response. Documented records, including property purchase documentation and identification, confirmed lawful ownership. The divergence between perception and documentation shaped the trajectory of the encounter. The situation also highlights racial perception versus legal standing. The only descriptor provided in the 911 call was that the individual was a black male. There was no report of forced entry, trespassing, or theft. The call relied on appearance-based suspicion. That suspicion was sufficient to prompt dispatch and on-scene questioning. Institutional image versus operational practice is another tension point. Publicly, police departments often emphasize procedural neutrality and bias awareness. Operationally, dispatch systems rely heavily on caller descriptions. In this case, the framing of the call set expectations before officers arrived. When the dispatcher stated, "Caller unsure," says he doesn't look like a resident, it influenced the patrol unit's assessment prior to independent verification. The broader institutional issues extend to the potential weaponization of emergency services. When 911 is used to report individuals based solely on appearance without evidence of criminal conduct, law enforcement resources are activated in a manner that can subject lawful residents to investigative scrutiny. The system depends on caller credibility but lacks mechanisms to immediately assess motive or bias. Bias-influenced dispatch language is another factor. Dispatch logs documented the caller's words and categorized the incident accordingly. There was no immediate attempt to verify property records before sending officers. The classification as suspicious activity, rather than welfare check or routine verification, shaped officer conduct. Supervisory oversight became relevant after identity confirmation. Once command staff learned that the homeowner was a commissioner, internal communications reflected concern about procedural exposure. Supervisors were responsible for evaluating whether the responding officers followed protocol and whether dispatch procedures required modification. Internal versus external accountability standards also came into focus. Public statements described the incident as a misunderstanding resolved at the scene. Internal review documents reportedly examined dispatch phrasing and officer decision-making more closely. The difference between external messaging and internal assessment became part of the case's broader examination. Whether protocol changes occur only when high-profile figures are involved remains a measurable question. If the homeowner had not held leadership authority, the call may have remained a standard suspicious person interaction without review beyond routine documentation. The commissioner's identity elevated the event to administrative scrutiny. The 911 caller's role evolved from anonymous complainant to central catalyst in a public debate. Initially, the caller acted as a neighborhood observer reporting perceived irregular activity. There were no publicly documented prior instances of emergency misuse associated with her. After the incident gained attention, her decision to call became part of discussions concerning bias-based reporting. The responding officers were mid-level patrol personnel with defined authority to investigate suspicious activity. Their actions were consistent with dispatch information as relayed. However, their decision to initiate questioning before verifying property ownership through internal systems became a focal point in review discussions. Supervisory command held responsibility for assessing compliance with departmental guidelines. Their evaluation balanced procedural standards, public perception, and institutional liability. Internal memos addressed training reinforcement and dispatch review procedures. Public-facing statements emphasize resolution without escalation. This case illustrates how routine systems operate when perception, authority, and documentation intersect. A neighbor observed a man entering a residence. A call was placed. Officers responded under a framed assumption. Identification altered the trajectory. Supervisory involvement followed. The event moved from street-level interaction to departmental review. The incident did not involve arrest, force, or physical escalation. Its significance lies in procedural mechanics. It demonstrates how racial descriptors can initiate law enforcement contact absent criminal conduct. It reveals how identity recognition can alter institutional urgency. It provides a documented example of how emergency systems function when suspicion is based solely on appearance and ownership is later verified through documentation. The address remains the same. The dispatch logs remain archived. The body-worn camera footage documents the exchange. The administrative review reflects institutional awareness. The structural questions raised by the incident extend beyond a single evening on Hawthorne Street. Public records and media-documented incidents over the past decade show recurring reports of suspicious person calls involving black residents engaged in routine, lawful activity. These calls frequently involve entry into residential property, waiting inside shared housing spaces, accessing vehicles, or using keys at doors. In several documented Boston area incidents, callers reported individuals as not belonging in apartment lobbies, condominium entrances, or private homes. Responding officers typically categorize these calls under suspicious activity, trespassing investigation, or possible breaking and entering. In many cases, no crime was substantiated after identification was presented. Outcomes followed a similar pattern. Officers requested identification. Individuals produced keys, access codes, or residency documentation. Officers cleared the scene without arrest. The caller faced no citation for misuse of emergency services. In documented cases where body camera footage was released, the framing language in dispatch logs often mirrored the caller's phrasing without independent verification. Descriptors such as "doesn't look like he lives there" or "unknown male attempting entry" appeared in call summaries. Disciplinary responses in those earlier cases were limited. When public attention increased, departments announced bias awareness retraining for officers or dispatcher review sessions. There is no public record indicating criminal charges against callers unless false information was knowingly fabricated beyond suspicion. The pattern demonstrates that racialized suspicion has previously entered the dispatch system without verification standards requiring corroboration before officer deployment. Boston Police Department procedures allow officers to respond to suspicious activity calls and conduct field interviews when reasonable suspicion exists. The threshold for reasonable suspicion in many suspicious person calls is shaped by dispatcher input. In prior cases, officers relied primarily on caller narrative. Identity verification occurred after initial questioning. Property ownership checks through municipal databases were not consistently conducted before in-person confrontation. Publicly available training manuals indicate that officers have access to property tax databases, vehicle registration systems, and warrant checks through mobile terminals. However, policy does not uniformly mandate database verification before initiating contact in property entry calls. Supervisory notification protocols vary. In routine suspicious person stops, supervisors are not always required to respond unless escalation occurs. Review of previous incidents shows supervisors were often informed only if a complaint was later filed, or if the situation involved arrest, use of force, or media presence. In this case, the responding officers initiated questioning immediately upon arrival. The decision to question before verifying ownership through available systems aligns with prior documented stops based solely on caller suspicion. When examining multiple cases collectively, several patterns emerge. A significant portion of prior bias-based 911 calls involved black individuals entering homes, apartment complexes, or vehicles. The common feature was lawful access combined with third-party suspicion. Dispatch summaries often incorporated subjective caller observations into official call logs without qualifying language. Terms such as possible break-in were used even when callers stated uncertainty. There is no evidence of immediate consequence for callers whose suspicion proved unfounded, unless a false report was knowingly fabricated. The act of calling based on perception did not trigger citation. Officer training materials prioritize response time and officer safety. There is limited procedural emphasis on pre-contact verification in suspicious entry scenarios. In previous cases that gained public attention, departments issued statements emphasizing commitment to fairness and announced training reviews. Structural policy revisions were limited. The current case reflects each of these patterns: property entry, racial description, immediate questioning, and absence of caller penalty. Several procedural checkpoints existed before escalation occurred. Dispatch could have required the caller confirm observable signs of forced entry rather than relying on perception of belonging. A verification prompt, such as confirming broken locks or tampering, might have reclassified the call. Officers had access to property ownership databases. A query of the Hawthorne Street address before initiating questioning could have established ownership status. A supervisor could have been notified at dispatch stage for property entry calls lacking evidence of forced entry. Early oversight may have redirected response protocol. Each of these points represents a procedural opportunity where escalation could have been reduced or prevented. 6:55 p.m. Final normal moment. The homeowner unloads boxes and personal belongings from a vehicle parked in the driveway of 14 Hawthorne Street. The property closing had occurred earlier that day. No police presence at this stage. 7:18 p.m. Triggering event: a neighbor places a 911 call reporting a black male entering the property using a key and moving items inside. Caller states uncertainty but claims the individual does not appear to belong. 7:19 p.m. Dispatch categorizes call logged as suspicious activity, possible unauthorized entry. Dispatch audio reflects uncertainty but assigns patrol response. 7:23 p.m. Officers arrive. 2 patrol units arrive. Officers approach the front steps. Initial questioning begins immediately. Body camera activation confirmed. 7:26 p.m. Identification presented. The homeowner presents identification, keys, and documentation related to property purchase. Officers radio dispatch for confirmation. 7:30 p.m. Internal communication: a supervisor is notified after identity verification reveals the homeowner's position within Boston PD leadership. Following morning incidents summarized in internal report. Command staff informed. Within 48 hours, media inquiry submitted after information circulates externally. Weeks later, internal review findings drafted. Policy compliance evaluated. Control by homeowner. Visible on body camera footage. Confirmed functional in door lock. Closing paperwork dated same day. Control by homeowner. Later referenced in internal review. Municipal ownership database accessible to officers. Not queried until after confrontation. Controlled by Boston Emergency Communications Center. Release following public records request. Shows caller uncertainty but racial descriptor included. Controlled by Department Records Division. Logged as suspicious activity without forced entry confirmation. Controlled by Boston PD Evidence Unit. Release in redacted form after review. Shows questioning prior to database verification. Controlled by Department Administration. Revealed supervisory concern regarding public perception risk. Maintained initial concern about unfamiliar presence. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing. State reliance on dispatch categorization. Indicate no intent beyond verification. Some confirm moving activity consistent with relocation. Not contacted prior to dispatch. Concluded policy technically followed. Recommended review of dispatcher phrasing guidelines. Outline suspicious person protocol. Do not mandate pre-contact ownership verification. Emphasize transparency and commitment to fairness. Did not indicate disciplinary action. Dispatch audio reflects uncertainty. Official summary frame call as possible unauthorized entry. Body camera footage shows identification presented within minutes. Initial reports emphasize officer professionalism without detailing delay in verification. Internal emails reference sensitivity due to position, absent from public statement. Body-worn camera footage begins when officer standing on the front steps of a residential property on Hawthorne Street in West Roxbury. The officer states, "Sir, we receive a call that you may not belong at this address." The homeowner, holding a set of keys and paperwork, responds that the property is his. The officer requests identification. The exchange lasts several minutes before dispatch confirmation alters the tone of the interaction. That shift marks the beginning of the institutional phase of the case. The property sits in a residential section of West Roxbury, a neighborhood characterized by single-family homes and long-term residents. Property records show the home was recently purchased through a recorded transaction. The closing documents list the homeowner's legal name, matching the identification presented during the encounter. No prior criminal complaints were associated with the address. The 911 call originated from a nearby residence. The caller reported observing a black male attempting to access the property and stated uncertainty about whether he lived there. The call was categorized as suspicious activity. No allegation of forced entry was made during the initial dispatch log entry. The homeowner was not an unknown civilian. He held the highest-ranking leadership position within the Boston Police Department. His professional history included decades of service, promotions through supervisory ranks, and public-facing reform initiatives. His authority extended over departmental operations, policy enforcement, and internal investigations. This status was not known to the caller. Responding officers initially treated him as they would any reported suspicious individual. The moment his identity was verified through dispatch marked a transition from routine field contact to internal institutional matter. The dispatch recording indicates the caller used a phrase, "doesn't look like he belongs." That wording was relayed to responding officers. The dispatcher categorized the call under suspicious person rather than breaking and entering, as no damage or forced entry was alleged. The phrasing influenced officer expectation before arrival. The absence of a reported crime did not prevent a police response. The categorization set the framework for how officers approach the interaction. Dispatch language shapes officer readiness. When officers hear suspicious, they prepare for possible criminal conduct. In this case, the call lacked specific unlawful behavior. However, the mention of a person who did not belong established a presumption requiring verification. The officers arrived expecting uncertainty about lawful presence. The homeowner was required to produce identification and property documentation. Database verification occurred only after questioning began. Video shows the homeowner unlocking the door and standing on his own property. Officers requested identification and proof of residency. The homeowner complied. No search was conducted. No detention beyond questioning occurred. The turning point occurred when dispatch confirmed the homeowner's identity and position within the department. Officer demeanor shifted. The questioning ended shortly afterward. No citation or arrest followed. Within hours, internal command staff were notified. An administrative review was initiated. Supervisors requested body camera footage and dispatch audio. The incident was elevated from field contact to internal evaluation due to the homeowner's role. Emails circulated among command staff referenced optics and procedural review. The review focused on whether officers followed protocol and whether dispatch classification required revision. An internal review was formally opened. Supervisors examined dispatch logs, body camera footage, and officer reports. The department publicly acknowledged the incident within days after media inquiries began. The public statement described the incident as a misunderstanding resulting from a neighbor's call. The term bias was not used in the initial release. The statement emphasized that officers responded appropriately to a call for service and followed standard identification procedures. Language focused on procedural compliance rather than discriminatory implication. The framing avoided labeling the event as misconduct. Media interviews were scheduled with department representatives. Community outreach sessions were announced to address concerns regarding bias-based calls. A policy review regarding suspicious person dispatch categorization was publicly referenced. The department emphasized training and review rather than discipline. Internal emails referenced reputational risk and public trust impact. The tone in internal communications acknowledged sensitivity surrounding racial perception. Public messaging framed the incident narrowly as routine procedure. Disciplinary findings concluded officers did not violate existing policy. External messaging emphasized transparency and review. Internal documents show concern about public interpretation rather than policy breach. No criminal charges were filed against the caller or officers. Civil action was evaluated but not publicly pursued. Legal exposure centered on potential civil rights claims. No formal lawsuit was announced. Officers involved were not terminated. Records indicate counseling or retraining was considered or implemented. The department concluded policy had been followed as written. Dispatcher retraining was announced, focusing on clarifying criteria for suspicious person categorization. A review of bias-based 911 call handling procedures was initiated. No binding ordinance or legislative mandate resulted from a review. Would the outcome have differed if the homeowner were not the department's leader? Are there standardized consequences for callers who initiate bias influence reports? How many similar calls involving non-authority homeowners remain undocumented? The officer's initial statement, "We received a call that you may not belong at this address," anchors the case. That sentence initiated the verification process. Suspicion alone triggered law enforcement response despite documented ownership. Identity recognition altered the duration and tone of the interaction. Institutional review escalated because of the homeowner's position. Dispatch language influences officer perception before arrival. Internal review processes activate more rapidly when high-ranking officials are involved. Institutional accountability appears proportional to public visibility. The address on Hawthorne Street remains unchanged. Department policy language remains under revision. Equal treatment under similar circumstances can only be measured when authority is absent. Body camera footage was retained under department control. Dispatch audio was released following media pressure. Internal findings were summarized publicly, while detailed internal communications were obtained through records requests. Prior bias-related calls in the city did not consistently trigger public statements or policy review. Most were resolved at field level without administrative attention. The department framed the response as transparency-focused while avoiding admission of systemic bias. Emphasis remained on training rather than enforcement against misuse of 911. Media coverage highlighted racial dynamics and authority reversal. Official messaging emphasized routine procedure. Legal advisors reviewed potential liability exposure. No settlement was publicly reported. Training modules were updated. Public awareness increased regarding bias-based calls. Structural enforcement mechanisms for misuse of emergency reporting remain limited. The event began as a routine dispatch entry. It transitioned into an institutional evaluation once identity was confirmed. The documentation shows no policy violation under existing standards. The broader implication remains procedural, how emergency systems interpret suspicion, and whether institutional response varies depending on who stands at the front door.